So first, I'm just going to talk about very general tools that we use. The most important things for me are rounds and check-in and check-out. Very basic things, but not typically done in a standard meeting. And then I'm going to talk about consent. If you've been to a workshop or learned about sociocracy somewhere, then you know that consent is how we make decisions. And we're going to compare it a little. We're going to talk about objections. I'm going to briefly touch sociocratic elections. Briefly only because if not the whole organization adopted sociocracy, most things you can still do, like expect consent and ask for a round, check in, check out, how you treat objections. However, sociocratic elections are very specific. So this is only relevant for people who are part of a sociocratic organization, which I'm expecting not everybody is. So I'm going to touch it briefly, but this is really only relevant for people who adopted the whole package. Oh, and then I wanted to mention where facilitation or this facilitation webinar fits into everything that can be taught in sociocracy. All right, so I'm diving in. Rounds. Why do we do rounds? Backing off real quick, I'm pretty sure most of you know that, but a round is just basically asking everybody, doing a go around in your circle meeting or in your group, hearing from everybody one by one. One can pass, but then typically you come back to that person. The idea is that we want everybody to be heard. And that supports equal voice, and that is one of the quintessentials of sociocracy. We want to give everybody the same voice. Especially introverts are typically supported by that. They have quite some time to prepare what they want to say. They might still feel on the spot, but that's sort of you can make it as easy as that for them. So in that way for introverts, but also for extroverts, rounds support speaking. So you can plan what you want to say. You're going to have your turn. You will be able to speak without being interrupted. So that is it's a small, very innocent looking tool, but it has a huge effect on what a meeting feels like. The interesting thing, what people forget, is that rounds also support listening. That typically is only the case when the whole group is used to doing rounds. Otherwise, it's hard for people to not speak up when it's not their turn. But once that culture is set, it really supports listening because you don't have to interrupt somebody to be heard. So you know that you're going to have your turn. So you can as well just sit and listen. And that's what people do. After a while, when things have calmed down and everybody has eased into sociocratic ways of doing it, people typically listen better. And of course, that also then leads to more effective meetings because you don't really get to a point where you go oh, why didn't you say that in the first place? Well, I did, So those kind of situations that make meetings so ineffective are typically caught by doing rounds. Rounds also keep you on topic because if person A speaks, person B speaks, person C speaks, they will all always speak to the question that was asked, speak to the prompt. So you're not going to go from, one to the other to the next as for topics because everybody is answering the same question. So it keeps you on topic. That is a huge advantage of rounds. I said already, so all of these advantages of rounds really then lead to more effective meetings and to what we said, equal voice, equivalence of voices. So I say as a facilitator, rounds are your best friend because you don't have to think much. You can just start with a round. You can finish up with a round. And the best ones are actually the rounds that you do when you feel stuck yourself. When you feel like somehow this doesn't feel right. The meeting is somehow going in a direction and it gets more and more heated. And I, as a facilitator, feel like I should do something, but I don't know what. So if you've ever been in that place, the best thing to do is say hold on, can we pause here? I feel like we're not really on topic and things get a little muddy. I would like to call a round, go back to a round, and you can even call it a round and process. So how are we going to proceed on this topic? How are we going to make a decision? How can we continue to talk about this? Go one level up. And this is something you can even do when you're not the facilitator. You can ask the group and share that that would be a good idea in your view. So rounds and process, I already mentioned that. When a discussion gets out of control, when the facilitators get confused, which can always happen, when the process feels muddy, and we all have a gut feeling around that. So I always like to have a few phrases on hand. One of them is, let's do a round on how we could move ahead from here. And then everybody in the circle will answer that question. Then it's not on you as a facilitator, but it's on the group. You sort of give the responsible to the group, and that really helps everybody. All right, the next topic was check-in and check-out. It is very obvious, but I've been to so many non-sociocratic meetings where check-in sort of gets forgotten, and it is so essential to me. One reason to do check-in is we meet as human beings, and also we might share what might be affecting our behavior in the meeting. When I just had a super stressful day, that might be affecting how I am in a meeting, or whether I'm tired, my mind is somewhere else, I might be I don't know, my thoughts might still be with somebody who is sick or something like that. If I was sitting in a meeting with people who I'm close with and who are dear to me, and they have something urgent on their mind from their personal life, I would like to hear about it. Also, of course, we get to know each other in a group where you don't live together or you don't work together. It's just, say, something like a volunteer organization. It helps to get to know each other, just to share one thing from your life. And we can focus on the meeting, so it gives you some transition time to actually focus on what the topic is. Then the opposite of it is the evaluation round, and that is also something that can get skipped easily, but that is a very helpful tool. We can reflect on our own experience, so we don't just rush out of the meeting. We do a round, and so what was this meeting like? And that also means you have to think for yourself. So what was this meeting like? Obviously, we will then, if we do a round and hear from everybody, hear other people's experience that might be different or might be the same. Either way, it's going to inform us. So that leads to more transparency, and it leads to a dynamic learning organization, because if you run into the same issues as for process every single time as a group, then at some point it will be time to bring that up. I'm like, so why is it that on that topic we always go into debate style? It's not something we want to ignore. It's something that, quite the opposite, we want to address, because only then we can learn from it. All right. So those are rounds and evaluations, and check-in, check-out, so to speak, are tiny tools, but I hope I made clear enough why they contribute so much to sort of the spirit that we have in sociocracy. One big tool set is how we make decisions, and I'm only going to talk about consent now. And the whole how to come to a proposal, I'm going to skip that, and I really hope that if you are more interested in that, we will be able to maybe just do a webinar on that, because that is a huge topic. So consent, what is consent? So consensus, if we put it on a slogan, I know that there's many versions of consensus, but if we put a slogan on it, in consensus you ask, do you agree? In consent, you ask, do you object? And the difference is, if you ask me, I will probably have an opinion. That is basically asking for the preference. If you ask, do you object? You will only hear about the real objections. You won't hear about the people who say, yeah, you know, that's not what was my preference, but it's totally fine to do it that way. They won't slow down the process. There might be other places in proposal shaping where that can be heard, but for the decision, we only want to hear about the objections, because that's where we can actually make the proposal better. Consent is an active process, and that is sort of in the back of my mind when I wrote that was, in consensus, you can stand aside. But depending on what the group culture is, it's a little unclear sometimes what that means. Does it mean if the proposal is getting carried out and it doesn't work, the people who stood aside will they then gonna say, well, you know, I was not like in support of this anyway. So if you consent, it is an act. If you weren't silent, you actually have to say, I consent, or I do not have an objection. That means you're in the boat. So in sociocracy, we sort of always have the both ends of group responsibility and individual responsibility. And that is where, for me, individual responsibility comes into play, because you have to say, yes, I consent. You can't just say afterwards, well, you know, I wasn't really like, whatever. So, because that will turn the whole thing into winners and losers, and we will see more about that later. So, shared responsibility. The whole group has carries the responsibility for a decision. Shared ownership, that also means on the positive side, they will all own it because they all made the decision together. Comparison with majority vote. If you vote in a meeting, you will have winners and losers, unless 100% yes. Majority vote is used so often, and we do not see how the culture around it is really about winning and losing. And that's why in sociocracy, we'd rather work in the objections and make the proposal better than just saying, well, you know, that's what we're doing now. And I've already talked quite a bit about consensus. The good thing in sociocracy is that it's not so much about people, it's more about objections, so that the whole group can own it. And then you sort of take the very emotional, personal thing out of a decision. We can decide to make a decision by other means. We can decide by consent to vote. To be honest, I've never seen that happen. We could decide it because by consent we can decide anything. I would have to come up with scenarios and really think hard whether that would even make sense. So what you can do in any organization is just expect consent as the decision-making tool. Most organizations don't define how they make decisions anyway. You can just expect consent on your part. So you can say things like, so are there any objections? That is something you can say. No matter whether there's going to be a vote or anything, you can still say that, and you don't even have to be the facilitator to do that. Or you could say things like, let's not implement this until we have enough information to resolve this objection. So every member of a committee can actually push for the process that supports equal voice and transparency and the no winners, no losers. I've already mentioned a few times that objections are an opportunity to make a proposal better. So really, when we shift our mindset, what we want to welcome objections because they're an opportunity. So the proposal will be stronger once we've dealt with the objections. So even in a non-sociocratic organization, you could ask, so now how is this going to work? What's wrong with it? Let's make it better. So you could gently shift the mindset to a more constructive way to look at issues around a proposal. So here's something I want to share with you. This is something that I'm happy to make available. It is already online on our website. This is what we call a decision-making sheet. And I know it's a lot of text, but I wanted to show you the big thing first, and then we're going to go into the parts that are relevant for us. And I know everybody's going to start reading now, but you will be able to read it after the meeting. So basically, the whole top part is what a policy meeting looks like. And you can sort of see like those, how it, the purple part, the content, agenda items, then sort of flips open to picture forming, proposal shaping, and so on, proposals, decisions, and then objections. So this is basically on one sheet what we give facilitators, and that's all you need. If you understand sociocracy, this is all you need. And although I've facilitated many meetings, I always carry it because it is really good to have it in front of you so you don't skip a step and then regret it after. So we are gonna look in the top left-hand corner. So green, you see the check-in, and green down below is the closing round. So this is sort of checking in, checking out. This is the frame of the meeting. Then you have administrative stuff in blue, and then the content agenda items. So this is how we structure a meeting. It's very simple, but the details really make it good. If there are objections, so you see on the right in purple that when you have a proposal, you do a consent round. And here is what happens with the objections. So during the consent round, you will hear objections. And then what happens? Sometimes people are a little afraid of so how are we going to do this? When there's an objection, what do we do? And this is very easy, really, if you look at it. First step is always seek understanding. Then you can amend the proposal, refer elsewhere. Those are the three things. And of course, there are subcategories of those. So seek understanding, what does that mean? We want to understand, is this a personal preference or is this an objection? If it's just a personal preference, maybe that person would be willing to let go of it and see that really it does not harm the circle's aim of what do we really want to do. The good thing about seeking understanding, really digging and seeing what's behind that, what's the concern here, why don't you think this is safe to do? Is that all circle members will own the concern, because typically people don't come up with wild ideas why they don't like something. Typically it's very valid concerns like safety. Even when an objection cannot be resolved, if it is thoroughly understood, everyone may be more willing to move forward and test the decision. Never underestimate the effect of listening and really listening. People want to be heard in their concern and are much more willing to let go of it if they've been heard first. Then, amend proposal. You can revise the content. I'm not going to go deeply into this because it's actually very obvious. You can change something. If you don't think $40 is a good idea, how about 50 or 30? You can change the term. This is something that is rather sociocracy specific. So if you don't think we should try this out for 6 months, how about 4 months? Would that feel better? 2 years is too long. Well, let's do 3 months and put something in place so we can measure what happens. That is the mindset of sociocracy. Try something, evaluate, and change it. So if you have a concern, let's look at it. But maybe there's a version that we can already try and put in place and then see what happens and actually see how we can measure whether what your fear is actually turns out to happen. You can see we looked at seek understanding, we looked at amend proposal. Now we're going to look at refer to. You can have a more focused circle. Say you have finances, maybe you have a subgroup of finances, let them deal with it. Or ask them for feedback. You can go to your, what I call the mother circle. Help us, we don't know what to do. Do you have some input for us? You can form an ad hoc group, which in sociocracy is called a helping circle, to do some research or just, for 2 or 3 people to think it through. So not 7 people have to do it. You can give a proposal back to the author and say okay, now you heard a lot of feedback. Can we just try and rewrite something and bring it back next time? Because this is getting too much into detail right now. Because we don't do wordsmithing with more than 3 people. It just does not make sense. It just doesn't. If you sit in a group of 7 people, the ideal size of a circle, you cannot do any wordsmithing. You can change a word or 2, maybe 1 sentence, but then typically it gets too complicated. People lose track of what the current version is and so on. Just don't do it. Send it somewhere. Take a 10-minute break and let 2-3 people do it. But don't do it in a whole group. It's just a waste of time. So, elections, I promise I'm going to just briefly touch on that. I hope many of you have been to workshops or seen a video. Elections in sociocracy are different from what we typically do. First, you review role, terms, and qualifications. So we're selecting a facilitator for 1 year, and we have a list of what we want that facilitator to be good at. We do a nomination round. Everybody in the circle writes down and then shares who they nominate for that role and why. So there's no, what is that called? Secret ballot. We share who we nominate and why. And then we do a change round. So you might be swayed by something you heard from somebody else. You can change your nomination. And then we do a consent round. The facilitator, after hearing the chain round, will make a proposal that he or she thinks most people will consent to, and then you have a consent round. I wanted to show you really quick that once you have access to this decision-making sheet, elections are down here. So I promised everything you need as a facilitator is on this sheet, and it's true. Why do we do elections that way? Sociocracy is about feedback. We want to be a learning organization. We want to get better at what we're doing. We want to get better at how we communicate. We want to get better at how we govern ourselves. That means we have to learn, and we only learn through feedback. So in a nomination round, you might hear things about yourself or hear things about somebody else that you did not know. And that is typically good. If it's criticism, which might happen too, that is also good because it gives you a chance to change something. And another point about the sociocratic election process is that a volunteer may not be the best person for the job. And the person who is may not volunteer. We're all familiar with that effect. So somebody volunteers and it's like, oh, okay, now he or she really wants to do it. But if we had actually done a selection process, maybe we could have found somebody to fill that role or do that job that would have done a better job. People often recognize abilities in others that others don't see in themselves. I've seen some wonderful sociocratic elections that really brought a group closer together. Everybody left the meeting feeling more connected, feeling more seen, and having made a good decision. So I really recommend sociocratic elections. You can maybe have somebody who might not be perfect for the job. We're not looking for perfect anyway. And then have an objection. So-and-so will be facilitator. Well, so-and-so has never facilitated. But we want that person to learn. Oh, so let's revise the proposal. Let's propose that so-and-so be facilitator, but takes a facilitation webinar, or gets a lot of feedback after every meeting. Like we all make an effort to really train that person, something like that. So once you treat a selection process just like a proposal, it gives you many more options of how you can make filling a role. The other thing is building leadership. So if you make an effort to train people and really encourage people through the process, it will build leadership. And you will be able to tap into group wisdom. Also, just briefly, I want to embed what you just heard into the big picture. So we have the basic principles of sociocracy. They're basically three. One is consent decision-making. You can see that on the current slide. How we make elections and how we do policy. We sort of touched all of those today. Everything that's blue, we didn't touch. We did not touch organizational structure, linking, double links, general circle, and so on, that decisions are made in small circles. You might know that. I just want to remind you that we just only saw a small fraction of what sociocracy is. It's not just a way to facilitate. Oh, and feedback is a essential part of sociocracy. We sort of heard some of that. We heard the evaluation. Now we heard something about feedback in election process after evaluation after meetings. We did not hear any of this.